One afternoon in late February of 2023, a 26-year-old man named Julio Bermejo walked toward a park in the city of Puno, Peru, with his girlfriend, Juanita. They were on the way to the park to meet Julio's two best friends, who he was finally going to be introducing Juanita to. To this point, they knew he had a girlfriend, but they had never actually met. And this, in and of itself, was actually kind of odd, because again, these are Julio's best friends, and Julio and Juanita had actually been together for a while now. But Julio had sort of always been a little hesitant to introduce her to his friends, because he knew, Juanita was just a little bit different. She was odd. And he knew that his friends might, pick up on that and maybe even make fun of him for it. He didn't know. He was worried that it would cause weirdness amongst the friends if they, had a chance to interact with his girlfriend. And so he just kind of kept her secret. But his friends knew he was dating Juanita, and they just really wanted to meet her. And so they kept pressuring him. And finally, he's like, you know what? We'll just go to the park. We'll meet up. I'm sure it'll be fine. And in order to ensure that this meeting would go as well as it could, Julio had also brought along with him as they're walking to the park, he had this big red cooler. And inside of it was all this rum and some cups and ice and stuff that they could drink while they're at the park. And for what it's worth, you're not allowed to drink in public in Peru. And Julio knew this. And so he was sort of weary of the fact that he's lugging this, obvious case of drinks out to a public park. And he was going to be drinking in public, but he felt like it was worth the risk. He would go out there, they'd have a couple of drinks, his friends would meet Juanita, it would all be fine. Eventually, Julio and Juanita reached the edge of the park. And up ahead, Julio could see his two friends waiting by this crumbling wall within the park. So most of Puno was covered in all these old ruins because there was this ancient civilization called the Incas who had lived there hundreds of years ago. And so this crumbling wall that his friends were sitting on was quite literally like an artifact, a remnant of the past. But it was sort of so commonplace in this area that people didn't even notice them. It was just sort of part of the landscape. And so Juanita and Julio and Julio's big red cooler full of rum, they lumbered their way through the park, dodging different, ruins that were jutting out of the ground, all the way over to the wall where the two friends were. And they actually hadn't seen them approaching. And so it was only when they kind of just were standing right in front of them that the friends looked and saw Julio, saw Juanita. And Julio, right away, he's sort of trying to gauge their reaction to Juanita and to this whole situation. But pretty quickly, his friends were, just pretty cool. And they were interested in Juanita. And, they quickly wanted to learn more about Juanita. And it was just like kind of easy. And Julio, he opened up the cooler right away. He got the cups out. He's filling them up with rum and soda. And all the friends are drinking. They're having a good time. And Julio's like, man, I was worried about nothing. My friends, they think Juanita is great. Yeah, she's different, but they think she's great. This has gone as well as it could have. And also, definitely the rum was helping. And so for a while, all four of them were just sitting around this, crumbling wall, drinking their rum. They're having a good time. And then at some point, Julio, who was facing his two friends, his friends, they sort of looked up and they had this look come over their face like they were worried about something that clearly was behind Julio. They sort of gasped when they saw it. And Julio, he's like, oh no, like, is it the police? Because they're out here drinking publicly and they're getting a little bit drunk and a little bit rowdy, with the exception of Juanita. She had drank the least of the group, perhaps to maintain some level of decency, perhaps. But, the two friends and Julio, they were pretty drunk and being loud. And so Julio, he turns around and his stomach just drops because, yep, here come the police. There are two officers coming over and he's thinking, the jig's up. They're going to clearly see that we are drinking in public. We can't even hide it. And so the officers, they walk over and, the friends are sort of panicking. They're putting their cups down. And Julio, he's just sort of resigned to his fate here. He's going to get in trouble. And the officers, they come over and they see the cups and they can clearly tell this group of people is drinking. But when they looked into that red cooler, that big red cooler that Julio had brought along, when they saw what was in there, they backed up and they told Julio to stay right where he was. So Julio and Juanita had actually been together for years. And despite his insecurities about her, about their relationship, he was ultimately pretty eager for his friends to finally meet her. But taking her to the park that day turned out to be a really big mistake. Because when the police arrived on the scene and they looked in Julio's red cooler, probably expecting to see alcohol, because that's very likely why they approached them in the first place. They did see alcohol, but they also saw Juanita. So Julio was right to be on edge about how his friends might react to seeing his girlfriend, seeing Juanita, because she was so different, right? That's his concern. And she was very different than your sort of average girlfriend, let's say. Because Juanita was actually an 800-year-old mummified man from the pre-Hispanic era, the period when the Incan civilization ruled the area. Julio's father had acquired Juanita, this mummy, decades ago. So Juanita had actually been a fixture in Julio's life since he was born. Now, Julio's best friends, really all of his friends, knew that, his family had this mummy, but they didn't take it seriously when Julio referred to the mummy as his girlfriend. Again, this is an 800-year-old mummified man, that he calls his girlfriend. They thought it was a joke. But, when it seemed like it wasn't a joke, when it seemed like Julio apparently had a real relationship with this mummy, the friends begged him to bring Juanita out. They wanted to see this amazing artifact. But they didn't realize that request, when they finally pushed Julio to come out to this park with Juanita in his cooler, because that's how he transported her, that would actually destroy their friend's actual love life. Because Julio was not joking when he called Juanita his girlfriend. He had very real, very deep feelings for this mummy. He'd even convinced himself that she was like an active participant in their relationship and sort of kept him in line, according to Julio. He said that Juanita would hold his hand and would poke his feet whenever he misbehaved. And so, when those two officers in the park came over to Julio and his friends and they looked in the cooler, they saw, Juanita, this mummy, partially inside of this cooler along with the rum. And so right off the bat, Julio and his friends, they're getting in trouble for that alcohol. But also, Julio was arrested and charged with the illegal possession of a historical item. But as of 2023, there's been no update on this case. As for Juanita, like the actual mummy, it was confiscated by the Ministry of Culture for research purposes. And that means very likely that she and Julio will be separated forever. Our next story is called Unit 85. One afternoon in 1984, a man named Dmitry carried a cardboard box down the hallway of this high-rise apartment building in the city of Kramatorsk, Ukraine. And this building was basically brand new. It was one of a bunch of developments that had been built right before the Moscow Olympics just 4 years earlier in 1980 as part of a push to show the world that the Soviet Union was a very successful and prosperous place. So very much by design, everything that they had built was very shiny and very modern and impressive, like this apartment building. And pretty much everybody in the area had been really desperate to get one of these new apartments, and Dmitry had lucked out. So a few weeks ago, Dmitry had been notified that one of the units had suddenly opened up, and he jumped at the opportunity to move in. He and his family had never lived in a place this nice before. I mean, there were brand new appliances, and the building had thick concrete walls with great soundproofing, so they didn't have to listen to their neighbors chat or watch TV like they had in many other places they lived before. Like, this was a huge upgrade. So today, Dmitry and his wife and two sons had basically spent the entire afternoon hauling their furniture in and getting situated because they're like, we want to move in here as fast as possible. His family was inside the unit now, unpacking basically everything else, and Dmitry was bringing up one of the very last boxes. But as he headed down the hallway toward his apartment, Unit 85, he saw a neighbor open up her door right up ahead, and the neighbor looked out at him. And as Dmitry got closer to this neighbor, he noticed that this woman looked incredibly sad and just kind of tired, like life had beaten her down. She was also really pale and very thin and gaunt, and she had bags under her eyes. And she was watching Dmitry with this strange expression on her face, almost like pity for Dmitry. And Dmitry, despite this initial reaction to what she looked like, he doesn't know her, and this is his neighbor after all, so he was about to stop and introduce himself to her, but right as he was about to, she suddenly went back inside of her unit and closed the door. The whole thing was just very weird. And Dmitry, after the door had shut, he just stood there for a second wondering if he should knock and ask the woman if there was some kind of problem, like was she okay? But in general, Dmitri was naturally kind of a quiet, introverted guy, and he very much preferred to mind his own business about pretty much everything. So he decided he would just leave the woman alone, which was pretty clearly what she wanted anyways. I mean, she's the one who shut the door and disappeared on him. So after a minute, he just walked the rest of the way down the hallway. He went inside of his unit, and he carried this cardboard box that he had lugged up here into the bedroom that his teenage sons were going to share. And when he got in there, he saw his boys were standing up on one of the mattresses, trying to hang a decorative rug on the wall behind their beds to kind of, freshen up the place. And Dmitri, he was glad to see that. It seemed like his sons were, leaning in to making this space their own. And so Dmitri, he set the box down and looked around their room. And with all their stuff there, it was already starting to feel like home. And he was sure that, despite the weirdness with his neighbor, that this has got to be the beginning of a really just amazing, new exciting chapter for he and his family. But Dmitri quickly realized that not everything in this building was as amazing as he thought it was. I mean, he'd already had that weird run-in with his neighbor, and it would turn out that was just the tip of the iceberg. Even though, his apartment and this whole building was undeniably nice and beautiful and modern, basically all of their neighbors were not nice. It was not just that one woman who appeared to be quite rude on that first day there. It was like every single person Dmitri ran into in this entire complex was quiet and sullen and grumpy and definitely not interested in talking to Dmitri. And then more than that, you have all these people that clearly didn't want anything to do with Dmitri and his family, but it was almost like all the time, the entire place was just silent. I mean, there was good soundproofing in this building, no doubt, but every time he walked down the hallway, it was just silent. Like nobody was making any noise in any of the apartment buildings. It was like this weird vibe that sort of hung over this whole place, like a sense of gloom and doom sort of persisted everywhere. And Dmitri just couldn't explain it. Like of all places to have that feeling be so present, why here? This is such a nice place. But Dmitri and his family, they stuck it out. They stayed in this apartment. And, despite how weird, it was, and it continued to be as weird as I've described here, pretty much the whole time they were there, Dmitri and his family, they tried to make the best of it. But a couple of years after they had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son started feeling unusually tired and weak, sort of similar to how the people in the building all seemed to act. And at first, Dmitri thought his son was just stressed with school or his social life or something, and maybe he just needed more sleep. But his son's symptoms just kept getting worse. And when Dmitri and his wife eventually took their son to the doctor, they found out that unfortunately their son had leukemia, which is a blood cancer. Now, this was obviously a total shock to the family because, this whole time they'd been chalking it up to, he needs more sleep, right? But to find out it was something so serious, they didn't even know what to think. And on top of that, Dmitri's son, who had the leukemia, he had always been like a really active, healthy kid. So this just felt like it came out of nowhere. But now he had to undergo cancer treatment and spend most of his time resting in bed. And despite doing those things, he just continued to get worse. A few months after Dmitri's older son got sick, Dmitri was sitting inside of an exam room at the doctor's office with his younger son, who was now also sick. He had a lot of the same symptoms as his brother, so Dmitri had taken him for blood tests right away, fearing, he could have leukemia too. So now they were waiting for the doctor to come back with those blood test results to see if that was the case. And when the doctor did finally come back into the room, Dmitri could tell by the look on the doctor's face that whatever they were going to say was going to be bad. And so the doctor, he sat down and said that Dmitri's younger son did also have leukemia. Dmitri was shattered. He was in complete disbelief here. He asked the doctor, how is it possible that both of my children could develop the same type of cancer in the same year? And the doctor said, well, there is an answer for that. This was hereditary. The whole family had a genetic predisposition to leukemia. That afternoon, Dmitri brought his youngest son home and told his wife and his older son the terrible news. And Dmitri just couldn't help but feel incredibly guilty. Like this was all his fault for passing his bad genes onto his kids. So once, everybody had begun to process the news and the sons were both in bed, Dmitri, just who didn't know what to do with himself now, he felt so terrible, he just decided to go out for a walk to clear his head. And so he did that. He went out, he walked around, and it didn't really work. He still had so much on his mind, so many bad thoughts passing through his mind. But when he got back to the building after his walk, as he approached the main entrance, he saw one of his neighbors sitting out on the steps, smoking a cigarette. It was actually that woman that he had first seen when he had moved in, the one who had poked her head into the hallway and then quickly closed the door without saying hello. Since that day, Dmitri had never spoken to her. He hadn't even tried to talk to her. Like, it was clear she didn't want anything to do with him or anyone else for that matter. And certainly tonight was not the moment he was going to go, talk to this woman. But very much to his surprise, as Dmitri, walked right past her and began walking up the steps to go inside the building, she actually turned and looked at him and just asked him, "Is everything okay?" And Dmitri was so caught off guard by this that he found himself just suddenly, very emotionally, sort of blurting out everything about his son's illnesses and how it was all his fault. And as his neighbor listened to him, she didn't seem surprised at all by what he was saying. And when he was done talking, she didn't ask a single question about it. In fact, she just nodded her head like, "Yep, that's too bad," as if she knew this was already going on, even though there was no way she could have known this stuff. And so when it was clear their conversation wasn't really going to go much further than Dmitri just sort of vomiting out all this information and her nodding, and that was sort of it, Dmitri was going to go back into the building, but she stopped him. And she did ask him a question. She asked him, "Do you know anything about the tenants who lived in your unit before you?" He said no. All he knew is that somebody had lived there, and then apparently they had left. That created the opening and he had jumped at the chance to move in. That's all he knew. And so she told him that, well, actually there's a story behind why this cleared up, why that unit cleared up. She said the previous tenants were a mother and her 2 teenage kids, and they had all died within 2 years of moving in. That's why it opened up. And they had died from leukemia. After hearing this, Dmitri couldn't help but feel like, okay, this doesn't seem like my kids got leukemia because this is hereditary. It feels like something else caused my kids to get sick that very likely is happening in my apartment. Like, how is it possible that both my kids got leukemia and the previous tenants who were in this unit also got leukemia? Like, there's no way. That's just coincidence. No way. And so Dmitri became absolutely obsessed with this idea that he was going to get to the bottom of whatever was going on inside of that apartment. And so over the next year, Dmitri made multiple serious efforts to get an inspector to come out and look at the apartment. He wanted them to check for a gas leak or toxic chemicals or something in the soil. But when he talked to building management, they just insisted that they'd already looked into all those things and everything was fine. Like this is just hereditary. It's just coincidental, drop it. But Dmitri couldn't let it go. And he kept pushing, asking anyone he could to just try to help him figure out if there's some external factor that's causing his family to become ill. But it all went nowhere. Basically, people just started ignoring his requests, and Dmitri felt like there was nothing he could do. By 1987, only a few years after Dmitri and his family had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son passed away from leukemia, and Dmitri's younger son continued to get sicker. Meanwhile, a rumor began to spread around the apartment building and also just across the whole area that Unit 85 of that apartment building must be cursed. 2 years later, on a cold morning in 1989, Dmitri came home from the hospital where his younger son was being treated to grab some clean clothes for himself and his wife. He and his wife were now spending virtually all their time at the hospital. It felt like they were at this point just waiting for their second son to die. That was the direction this seemed to be going. And so, of course, this is like a really miserable, awful time for Dmitri and his wife. And so when he got back to his apartment and after he got those clothes, instead of just immediately leaving and rushing back to the hospital, which was just so awful, Dmitri just wandered into his son's bedroom and just took a minute for himself. He sat down on one of the beds and he stared at that decorative rug that was hanging on the wall, which had been there since the first day they had moved in. The sons had put it up there. And when he looked back at that day, He remembered how excited and how hopeful his sons had been and how he and his wife had been for their new life here. Like, this felt like such an amazing opportunity. But that day, that move-in day, felt like a lifetime ago. Ever since then, nothing had gone the way they had expected. And so Dmitri wondered if maybe the rumor was true, that Unit 85, where they lived, maybe it really was cursed. And while he was thinking about that, something on the rug, the decorative rug on the wall, caught his eye. And so Dmitri, he got up and he walked over to this rug to get a better look. And at first, he couldn't even tell what he was looking at. But upon closer inspection, he knew something was wrong here. And it was wrong enough that he actually ran out of the room, picked up the phone, and called emergency services. So when Dmitri had moved in, he'd been so excited that he'd basically overlooked a lot of red flags. He never asked why the previous tenants would leave behind such a great apartment. Like, he didn't know it was because they died after living there for a very short amount of time. But he didn't ask. And he also didn't ask about why basically everybody on the premises just seemed so sad and lifeless all the time. Like, everybody acted that way. He never asked about it. And so ultimately, Dmitri's opinion of this place, of Unit 85 in this building, is that, you know what, there can be nothing wrong with living here. I mean, this is a modern place. Everything's so new and beautiful. Like, it has to be a safe place to live, right? But it would turn out being brand new and modern was actually what made this apartment building so dangerous. When this building was constructed, the Soviet government had been in such a rush to show off how wonderful and rich the country was in time for the Moscow Olympics that they'd made a terrible mistake. During the construction of this whole apartment building, the crew had lost a very small but very important piece of equipment. It was a capsule on a machine that measured the density of soil, which they used at the quarry where they were carving the stone that was used to build the apartments. Now, work had been paused so the crew could find this capsule, but the government also really didn't want there to be a big delay here because they wanted to show off this amazing place, in time for the Olympics. So after a week, even though the capsule was still missing, they just called off the search and resumed construction, figuring the capsule must just be somewhere in the quarry. But the capsule was not in the quarry. It ended up embedded into the stone walls of Unit 85. And this was a big problem because that capsule contained a substance called cesium-137, which is extremely radioactive. And so for the next 8 years, the people who lived in that apartment building, in particular in and around Unit 85, were receiving constant radiation exposure. That's why all of Dmitri's neighbors seemed sad and pale and lethargic. And that's also why Dmitri's family and the family before him who had lived inside of Unit 85, it's why they got leukemia. Dmitri discovered the awful truth in 1989 when he was in his son's bedroom and he was looking at the rug hanging on the wall. What he noticed on the rug was there was what appeared to be a burn mark. And when he looked more closely, he realized that the burn was coming from the wall itself that the rug was pressed against. Like, there was something in the wall causing this rug to burn. And so not really having any idea what that was, but knowing that, something odd has been going on here, he suspected for many years, and no one's really looked. This seems really odd. I better call the authorities. Well, when he did, the authorities came out and they inspected the apartment. And when they cut into that wall behind the rug, what did they find? The missing capsule. In total, 6 people who lived in this apartment building died, and 17 more were disabled, all because of the radiation in Unit 85. However, despite that being sort of hard facts, nobody was ever held accountable for this deadly incident. Our third and final story of today's episode is called A Bone to Pick. On the evening of September 17, 1896, a detective named John White dug a shovel into the ground outside of a home in Evanston, Illinois. So Detective White worked for the Evanston police, and that morning, the owner of the home that he was currently digging in front of had come in to report that he had found bones buried on his property. So White had been sent out there to see if they were human or animal. Now, White had actually already stopped by the home earlier to inspect a few of the bones the homeowner had pulled out of the ground, and his initial thought was they were likely just from a deer or some other animal, so he was not expecting this to be human bones. However, he had still come back to fully excavate this yard because this property was only a quarter mile from the former home of the infamous serial killer named H.H. Holmes, who had been caught just 2 years earlier. And H.H. Holmes had confessed to 27 murders, but the police believed that there were dozens or even hundreds more that they didn't know about. So if any of the bones that were found on this property were human, it was then very likely they were connected to this serial killer. And that would be a huge find for Detective White at a time when he desperately needed a win. Because just a week ago, a reporter from the Chicago Chronicle had published a very unflattering story about Detective White, about how he had bungled a case, which had made White sort of like the laughingstock of the police force. It had been very embarrassing. But more than embarrassment, I mean, Detective White cared a lot about his reputation. He cared about being a good detective. So he had been looking for a way to sort of get that story out of everybody's heads. And he thought, like, what better way to do that than to be the detective that finds these missing bones, these potentially missing bones of these victims that had never been found. And so White, who he's out here, part of this bigger excavation of this property, he takes a shovel and he begins to dig. And at some point, he hits something hard in the ground. At that point, White took a shovel away and he reached down and he carefully brushed away the dirt from whatever he hit. And eventually, when he revealed what it was clearly bone, but more than that, it was clearly human bone. It was an entire human skull. And so White, he was thrilled. This is like, in some ways, the best thing he could have found. This is undeniably human remains here. And that was sort of what he was hoping he would find. And there also wasn't much decay or discoloration on the skull, which suggested it had not been buried for very long, at least not more than a few years, which also highly suggested it was connected to H.H. Holmes, who had been caught 2 years ago. And so White, he's feeling really good. Like he's got the big find here. This is exactly what he hoped would happen. He knew the medical examiner would obviously have to look things over and confirm some things, but it certainly seemed like he had effectively struck gold. And it also seemed like this was going to be White's chance to really stick it to that reporter who just a week earlier had written that horrible article about him. Now look at White. Look what he was doing now. Nobody would remember that terrible article, and everybody would remember this. And so White, he stops digging, he wraps the skull in a blanket, and he heads back to the police station. And when he went in there, who was already inside talking to another officer? None other than that very reporter who had written that embarrassing article about White a week earlier. And so White, he's thrilled. Like, this is the best case scenario for him. He's got that skull that's wrapped in a blanket. And he made a point of, as he walked down the middle of the aisle of this big room full of all the other officers and desks and this reporter, he made a point to really indicate that he had something important in his hands and he was walking with a purpose here. But he really wanted to get the reporter's attention. And so he walks down the aisle, he's got his skull, and the reporter, he notices and stops what he's doing. And he turns and he looks at White and he's like, "Hey, what do you got there?" And so White, he turns to this reporter and, he stares at him like, "I know who you are. I know what you wrote about me." But what he does is he unfurls the blanket and reveals the human skull to the reporter. And the reporter's looking at it like, "What in the world?" And White's like, "Yeah, he's kind of gloating as he's doing this. He's like, "Yeah, I was digging up over at that property about a quarter mile from where H.H. Holmes lived. And I think I found another victim, a victim that nobody knew about. Yep, here it is. So there you go." And the reporter, he's staring at the skull. He's hearing what Detective White has said. And White could see the gears are turning in the reporter's head. Like, this is a huge story. And the reporter's like, "Oh my goodness, like, thank you. I got to write about this. This is amazing. I can't believe you've found this. This is incredible." And so White's like, this is the greatest thing. He's going to write a new article. It's going to feature me. I'm going to be the hero. And also, how great is it that this article is going to be written by him? Like, the same guy who talked bad about me is now going to make me out to be some kind of a hero. This is perfect. The next morning, when White walked into the police station, he was greeted with all his fellow officers cheering and clapping for him, congratulating him on this huge breakthrough, the find of this skull. So that Chicago Chronicle reporter had immediately written a story about White's big find, about finding the skull in that yard, and it had been front page news that morning. And so all of White's colleagues, everybody had read the story. He was the star. And to White's delight, the reporter even openly speculated that that skull might even belong to H.H. Holmes's former wife, Minnie Williams, who'd completely disappeared a few months after they had gotten married, which was a huge revelation because nobody knew what happened to her. And it was like, wow, Detective White, you figured it out. You found her. And so Detective White had the best day of his life. This is redemption. Everything is great. Until that night, on his way home from work, Detective White stopped at this very crowded newsstand to pick up a copy of the evening edition. He grabbed a newspaper off the shelf, and he looked at the front page, and unsurprisingly, his story, the Bones story, was still very much front page news. But as he read through the article, his stomach dropped. And then he heard a noise coming from all around him that made his blood run cold. It would turn out, other than the human skull that White dug up on that property, all the other bones that so far had been found on that man's property had been horse bones. And more than that, the skull did not belong to a murder victim. So, unfortunately, White's big breakthrough was not a breakthrough at all. But Detective White, he actually knew that. He had known that from the first second he stepped on that property. Ever since that embarrassing article had been published about White that week earlier, he'd become obsessed, not just with fixing his reputation, but specifically with getting revenge on that reporter who wrote it. And this bone scenario had given him, in his mind, the perfect opportunity. He had come up with this elaborate plan to plant the human skull, pretend to find it, and then tell that specific reporter all about it, in hopes that the reporter would write a completely incorrect story and then get publicly humiliated, exactly the way White felt like he had been humiliated. But White had underestimated this reporter, because the reporter, after seeing the skull that White showed him and writing that big article about how this skull could be connected to H.H. Holmes, the reporter, he gets that story out the door that morning. It's this big hit. After that, on that same day, the reporter went to the medical examiner to ask for more information about the skull. And quickly, he learned about the other bones, and he learned that this skull very likely was not connected to H.H. Holmes. And the reporter began to see that this looked like a setup. He saw through White's scheme. And so that evening, a whole new article had come out about White and his big discovery. And basically what it said was White was a petty moron who tampered with evidence and thought he could pass off horse bones for human ones. And so White, after reading this story and realizing what a terrible position he was in now, that sound he heard all around him that made his blood run cold was the sound of the other people all around him reading this article and laughing at his expense. On Sunday, May 27, 1984, 18-year-old Laura Salmon left her dorm at Middle Tennessee State University, got into her beige Oldsmobile, and headed down the main road that cut through the college town of Murfreesboro. About 10 minutes later, Laura parked her car at a movie theater, stepped outside, and then waved to a young man who was waiting for her over at the box office. The young man, whose name was Dan Goodwin, was one of the new friends Laura had made since starting her freshman year of college about 8 months earlier. And this was the first time they'd gone out together, just the two of them. Laura wasn't sure if this was a date or not, but Dan's invitation for dinner and a movie definitely made it seem like it could be. She and Dan said hello, and Dan told her he had not gotten the tickets yet, because he didn't know what movie she wanted to see. Laura smiled. A lot of guys she knew would have just picked whatever movie they wanted and not worried about what she wanted at all. The two of them settled on The Natural, a new baseball movie, and they bought some tickets. Dan was a gentleman the whole time, opening doors for Laura, paying for everything, and getting the snacks that she wanted. And when they walked out after the movie ended, Laura was having a good time and was looking forward to dinner. Laura and Dan ate at a restaurant in the same shopping center as the movie theater, and they spent most of the meal getting to know each other better. Laura said college had been a big adjustment from high school, even though she still lived pretty close to her mom. But for the most part, she had enjoyed her newfound freedom. She asked Dan if he had plans for what he wanted to do after college. Laura knew this was still a long way off, but she was already set on her career. She loved performing in plays, and she wanted to be an actress. Dan said he wasn't quite sure, but whenever he thought about it, he always came back to law enforcement. He thought maybe he could be a police detective. Laura laughed. She couldn't think of two more opposite careers than theater actor and cop, but despite their different life ambitions, they got along really well and had a great night. After dinner, Dan walked Laura back to her car, and they said they'd see each other soon. On the drive home, Laura kept laughing to herself. After a whole night out with Dan, she still had no idea if what they'd just done was actually a date or not. But she didn't want to worry about it. Dan was nice and they were friends, and that was not always the case with some of the guys she met in class or at frat parties. And she wasn't necessarily looking for something serious. She'd had a long-term boyfriend for most of high school, but college was different. She didn't want to tie herself down. Early on May 30th, 1984, 3 days after Laura had gone to the movies with Dan, she woke up to the loud beep of her alarm clock. She wanted to yell at herself for staying up so late the night before. She'd had a great time dancing at a local club and hanging out with her date, but now she was going to pay for it. She had an early shift at the supermarket where she worked part-time. Laura barely pulled herself out of bed and then got ready. She put on a pair of blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a black jacket, and then headed out the door for work. The following day, around 5 p.m., a farmer in Murfreesboro drove his truck down a road that ran across the acres of property that he owned. He looked out into a large hayfield near a rock quarry, and he saw something that immediately annoyed him. Somebody had left a pile of clothes out in the middle of the grass. Finding stuff like this had actually become routine because local college and high school kids had turned this part of the farmer's land into a place to party. Now, at least once a week, he had to go pick up trash and collect empty beer cans. The farmer parked on the side of the road and got out of his truck. He slammed the door behind him and walked through some tall grass towards the clothes on the ground. But as he got closer, he stopped and just began shaking his head. He hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him and he wasn't really seeing what he thought he saw. The farmer took a few steps closer and then ran right back to his truck. He sped down the road to his house and he called 911. About a half an hour later, Detective Bob Asbury and two deputies from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the hayfield and got out of their cars. The farmer had come back and was waiting for them. The farmer ominously pointed to a spot a few yards out in the high grass. The deputies stayed back to ask him some questions, and Detective Asbury put on his gloves and walked out into the field. And there, lying in the grass, he saw the dead body of a young woman. She was nude except for a bra, and her legs were spread open. A woman's black jacket covered most of her face, and lying on top of the jacket were 2 pairs of blue jeans. Asbury couldn't be sure, but the amount of bugs crawling nearby and the condition of her skin made it look like she'd been out there for a while, maybe overnight. Asbury crouched down next to the young woman's body. He could see deep wounds on the side of her head, the kind that usually indicate blunt force trauma. And the detective saw something clutched in her right hand. It was a pair of women's underwear. That detail, along with how her body was laying and the fact that she was almost naked, made Asbury think that this young woman had very likely been sexually assaulted before someone killed her. Asbury eyed the jacket covering her face, and that didn't seem too strange to him. Sometimes killers covered their victims because they couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. But the detective had no idea why somebody had also laid 2 pairs of jeans on her body. He carefully removed the jeans and then lifted the jacket to get a look at the woman's face. He saw deep bruises that looked similar to the other ones on her head, and it didn't take long for Asbury to find a potential murder weapon. He scanned the grass around the body, and he saw a couple of rocks caked with what looked like dried blood. Asbury was confident that one or both of these rocks had been used to beat this young woman to death. The detective stood up and picked up the jeans off the ground 1 pair at a time. The first pair were men's jeans. Based on the length, they appeared to belong to someone who was at least 6 feet tall. The second pair were women's jeans, and they looked like they could be the victims. Asbury reached inside one of the pockets, and he pulled out a student ID from Middle Tennessee State University. The photo on this ID matched the victim. This young woman was Laura Salmon. Detective Asbury and the deputies worked with a Tennessee State forensics team for hours out in the field. But the only major forensic evidence they found was the blood on the rocks and also the blood spatter on both pairs of jeans. This was 1984, so DNA testing was not used by police yet. But the forensics team would take the jeans and the samples from the rocks to the lab to determine blood type, and to see if they had samples from one or potentially more than one person. That night, when Asbury returned to the station, he found a message waiting for him on his desk. Laura's car had been located at the supermarket where she worked, a few miles away from where her body had been found. It was already getting late, but Asbury had no intention of stopping yet. So, he headed across town to the supermarket and found a couple of deputies waiting for him next to a beige Oldsmobile. The detective shined his flashlight into the driver's side window, and immediately something caught his attention. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like someone very tall had been driving. Asbury knew Laura was relatively short, and he knew the men's jeans he'd found near her body most likely belonged to someone much taller than her. So Asbury wondered if maybe the killer had sexually assaulted and murdered Laura, left his pants at the scene, and then driven Laura's car back to the supermarket. If that was the case, it indicated that Laura's killer knew her, or at least knew enough about her to know where she worked. The detective and the deputies did a full search of the car, but nothing else really jumped out. So, after the search, Asbury headed inside the store, and he quickly found a cashier who said she had worked with Laura the previous day. She said that she and Laura had both clocked in at 8 a.m. and worked a 5-hour shift. Afterward, they walked outside together, where Laura got in her car and drove off. Asbury asked this cashier if someone had maybe been waiting by Laura's car for her, but the cashier said she didn't see anybody, and Laura had not mentioned to her that she was meeting up with anyone. Detective Asbury walked back outside and headed to his car. If he was right, a tall man who knew Laura was the last person to drive her car. So he needed to speak to somebody who might know who that man was. The following morning, Detective Asbury met with Laura's mother at her house. Laura's mom had gotten the news about her daughter the night before, and Asbury could tell she hadn't slept since. He didn't want to stay long or push Laura's mother too much, so he offered his condolences and then got right to the point. He said he was looking for a tall man who knew Laura well enough to know where she worked. In his opinion, this guy was probably Laura's close friend or a current or past romantic partner. Laura's mom didn't hesitate. She said she knew someone who fit that description perfectly, a 17-year-old named Kyle Gilley who had been Laura's high school boyfriend. That afternoon, still less than 24 hours since Laura's body had been found, Detective Asbury led Kyle and his stepfather into a conference room at the sheriff's station. Since Kyle was a minor, Asbury had made sure he had a guardian with him when he came in for questioning. Asbury noticed right away that Kyle looked to be at least 6 foot 2 inches tall, and he was a big guy too, filled out, not skinny and gangly like a lot of teenagers. He was also very quiet. But without much prodding, Kyle said he'd heard about Laura's death and he was upset about it. The two of them had been together a long time in high school, and they were still close. Asbury asked him what he meant. Were they still a couple? Kyle shook his head. They were friends and they hung out sometimes, but they were not together anymore. The detective quickly followed up and asked if that made Kyle angry. But Kyle said it didn't. He was still in high school and Laura had gone off to college. He understood why, after she had graduated, she had wanted to break up. Asbury sized Kyle up again. Physically, he was the perfect fit for this. So he asked him if Kyle had ever left a pair of jeans out on that piece of farmland where kids in town went to party. Kyle got a confused look on his face. He knew about the spot on the farm, but he had no idea about any jeans of his that had gone missing out there. Detective Asbury finished by asking Kyle where he had been on May 30th, which, as far as the detective knew, was the last time anyone had seen Laura alive. Kyle said he'd come home after school, and he'd stayed there the rest of the day. And his stepfather corroborated that. He said he and Kyle had grilled a bunch of steaks together out on the patio and then had a barbecue with the family. Following his meeting with Kyle, Asbury continued to fixate on the pair of men's jeans he'd found covering Laura's body. He was convinced those jeans were the killers, so he just had to figure out who they belonged to. So he sent members of his team to meet with some of Laura's family and high school friends, and he drove to Laura's college campus to see if there were any other tall men in her life. Asbury walked up to the dorm room that Laura had shared with 2 other students. He knocked, and eventually a young woman answered. He showed her his badge, and she let him inside and said that she was one of Laura's roommates. Asbury looked around the room, and it looked like a typical dorm room shared by 3 young teenage girls. And this just made it hit home how tragic this murder really was. Laura was so young. The detective asked the roommate when she'd last seen Laura, and the roommate said it was the night before Laura had gone to work and never came back. That night, Laura had left the dorm to go dancing at a club with a guy she'd met. And before Asbury could even ask, the roommate said she did not know who that guy was. Detective Asbury spent the day talking to more of Laura's friends and classmates, and none of them seemed to know who she'd gone to the club with on that night. But a few of her friends pointed the detective to another young man, Dan Goodwin, who had taken Laura out to a movie and dinner a few days before she had died. Asbury tracked Dan down on campus, and the young man proved to be completely cooperative. He walked the detective through the entire day he and Laura had gone out. He said they were friends, and the date was totally casual. Nothing romantic or physical at all had happened between them. He also said he had not gone dancing with Laura at the club, and he'd never gone out to that farmland with her. By the time Detective Asbury left the campus, he had 2 potential suspects he at least knew something about. Dan, the casual date, and Kyle, the high school boyfriend. He also had a 3rd potential suspect who was a total mystery, the guy Laura had gone to the club with. Asbury would follow up on alibis and keep trying to identify the man at the club, but he was already desperate to find some new piece of evidence. The following morning, 3 days after Laura's body was found, Detective Asbury sat at his desk going over Laura's autopsy report. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, which didn't surprise Asbury at all. But there was something in this report that came as a total shock. There was evidence that Laura had recently had intercourse, but there were no physical signs that usually accompanied cases of sexual assault. This meant there was a strong chance the sex had been consensual and could have happened hours or even the day before the murder. This was not what Asbury had suspected when he'd first seen Laura's body, because she was naked from the waist down, her legs were spread, and she had underwear in her hand. So now, Asbury wondered if her killer had simply staged the scene to make it look like Laura had been sexually assaulted just to throw off investigators. If that was the case, the men's jeans might not belong to the killer at all. They could have been placed there by somebody else. In fact, if the crime scene had been staged like that, Laura's killer might not even be a man. On June 4th, 4 days after Laura's body was found, Laura's mother sat in the chapel crying as mourners filed out of Laura's funeral. Dan, the young man who had gone out with Laura just days before she died, walked up to Laura's mom and said how sorry he was and how wonderful a person Laura had been. Laura's mother instinctively pulled Dan in for a hug, and she told him to please help her find who killed her baby. Dan gave her a big hug back and then looked her in the eye and said he would. He would find Laura's killer. Over the next month, Detective Asbury and members of the Tennessee State Police continued to interview Laura's friends and acquaintances, but they weren't getting any closer to identifying her killer. And then, one afternoon, Asbury got a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, 40 miles away. The Nashville cop said a woman had just accused a man named John Taylor of raping her, and she claimed that John had told her if she resisted, he would do to her what he did to Laura Salmon. Asbury almost couldn't believe it. It was like the huge tip he had been waiting for had just fallen into his lap. talking to the Nashville officer, Asbury quickly learned that John had a history of violence, and he went to Middle Tennessee State University just like Laura. Asbury hung up and took off for Laura's campus. When he got there, he looked up John's records and began sifting through those, and then he also spoke to some of Laura's friends he'd already met, and it would turn out that Laura and John went to the same fitness center on campus, and they'd gone to a bunch of the same fraternity parties. At this point, Asbury didn't waste any time. He and a state police officer drove right to Nashville to interview John, who was still in custody on the rape charge. John insisted that the sex between him and the woman accusing him of rape was consensual, and he claimed he never said a word about Laura. That was a total lie. And like Asbury's other suspects, John said he'd never gone dancing at a club with Laura, and he said he barely even knew who she was. Asbury left Nashville later that day feeling frustrated. But despite John's claims that he was innocent, the detective thought he made a very strong suspect. However, unless he could find something concrete connecting John or the other young men who were suspects directly to the crime scene on the farmer's land, then he couldn't go after any of them. Over the next several weeks, Detective Asbury continued to work the case every day, but he never felt like he was getting any closer to solving it. Soon, months passed without any new evidence coming in, and Asbury had other cases he had to start focusing on. During this time, Laura's mother came to the sheriff's station often, but every time she asked for an update on her daughter's case, she got the same reply. There was no new information at this time. And Laura's mom got that same response for years. She watched as Laura's friends graduated college and went on with their lives. She saw the young men who had been suspects in her daughter's murder grow up and start families of their own. And she saw Detective Asbury retire and Laura's case go completely cold. Fast forward to February of 2000, almost 16 years after Laura's murder. Two detectives with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department stood over a conference table, staring down at a stack of file folders. These detectives had been assigned to handle cold cases, and their first big case together was Laura Salmon's murder. The lead detective was Lieutenant Bill Sharp, and the detective assisting him was none other than Dan Goodwin, the same young man who had taken Laura out for a movie and dinner shortly before she died, and the same Dan who had promised Laura's mother he would find Laura's killer. Dan, who was now in his 30s, flipped open one of the folders and saw a photo of Laura. Then he began flipping through pages of notes from the original investigation, and as he did, he felt Lieutenant Sharp standing over him. Sharp leaned down and wrote 3 letters across the top of one of Laura's files, DNA. Dan nodded. Technology had come a long way since Laura's murder, and now DNA testing was commonplace and effective and could potentially solve this case. So the first step the investigators took was to connect with the state crime lab. They arranged for a series of tests to be conducted on the blood samples taken from the rocks found at the murder scene and from the 2 pairs of blue jeans that had been left on Laura's body. All the samples had been well preserved, so the lab felt confident they would find something. However, they informed Dan and Lieutenant Sharp that the lab was pretty backed up, and it might take a while to get results. So while they waited, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp began working their way through the files and re-interviewed everyone they could. They also tracked down Laura's old high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, and secured a DNA sample from him. And they did the same with John Taylor, the man who had been accused of rape by that young woman in Nashville. And on a day not long after those samples had been sent to the lab, Lieutenant Sharp approached Dan at the station. Sharp tossed a file folder onto Dan's desk and told him, "Now it's your turn." Dan flipped open the file and saw it was a record of his interview from the original investigation. For a second, it threw Dan off. He'd been so caught up in his work that he hadn't thought about himself as being a potential suspect. But he told Sharp that, of course, he would provide a DNA sample. Despite the fact that Dan was a suspect in this case, he was allowed to stay on the investigation, because after he had provided his DNA sample, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was not Laura's killer. In the spring of 2000, a couple of months into this new investigation, Dan and Sharp sat at the conference table, digging through Laura's files like they did almost every day. They had conducted interviews, revisited the crime scene, and they had secured DNA samples, but they were still waiting on DNA test results. And they were starting to feel like the original investigators had felt. There were several solid suspects, but not enough evidence to point to any one of them. But that particular day, something in one of the files jumped out at Sharp for the first time. It was a witness statement from a young woman that seemed to have just gone overlooked during the original investigation, and it was potentially a huge break. Lieutenant Sharp pointed it out to Dan, and Dan just stared in shock. Suddenly, he felt like he was close to solving the murder of his friend and keeping his promise to her mother. Both detectives meticulously went through the other files to see if anyone had ever followed up with this witness, but no one ever had. So Dan and Sharp tracked her down. And even though so much time had passed, this witness said she still remembered that day very clearly, and she stood by her original statement. The detectives knew a single statement from over 15 years earlier would not be enough for the district attorney to take a murder case to trial, but they felt like their investigation finally had a clear direction. Then, on May 31st, 2000, 16 years to the day from when Laura's body was found, DNA test results came back from the lab. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp sat at the table and read the report, and both felt completely energized and like they were almost at the end of this investigation. The test results confirmed that the blood on the rocks and on both pairs of jeans was Laura's, but the blood pattern found on the men's jeans could only have occurred if the person wearing them had been on top of Laura when she was struck in the head. So there was now strong evidence that Detective Asbury had been right from the moment he saw Laura's body back in 1984. The men's jeans belonged to the killer. Dan and Sharp kept reading through the results, and as they did, they kept feeling more and more like the witness they had spoken to must have been telling the truth. And then finally, they saw test results that said DNA samples from bodily fluids had been found in the men's jeans, and they had a match for those samples. Dan stepped back from the table, and he felt like he wanted to collapse, like a huge burden had finally been lifted. After all this time, Laura's murder had just been solved. Based on DNA tests, the witness statement, and evidence collected over 16 years during 2 investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Laura Salmon on May 30th, 1984. That afternoon, Laura walked out of the supermarket with her coworker, said goodbye, and then got into her car. As soon as she began driving, she felt like she might fall asleep. She was exhausted from her night out at the club the night before. She drove a few minutes across town and saw her killer waiting for her right outside of their place. Laura parked, got out of the car, and told the killer how exhausted she was. She also said she could only hang out for a little while. The killer said that was totally fine, and they offered to drive since Laura was tired. Laura tossed her car keys to the killer, and then they both climbed into her beige Oldsmobile. The killer immediately had to move the driver's seat way back so they could fit, and then once they were comfortable, they began driving down the main road in town. But a few minutes later, the killer suddenly pulled onto a road that cut through some farmland. Laura asked where they were going, and the killer said it was a surprise. The killer drove a bit longer, and then parked the car on the side of the road by a hayfield that was near a rock quarry. Laura looked out the window. She knew the spot from some parties. It was a beautiful day, and Laura was still feeling pretty sleepy, so sitting outside in this field seemed like a nice way to spend some time. However, before Laura could get out of the car, the killer snapped at her and started yelling at her about the night before. Laura yelled right back and said the killer was way out of line. And then she told them to just turn the car around and drive her back to her dorm. But the killer didn't. Instead, they lunged across the front seat, grabbed Laura, and punched her in the face. Laura's eye and her head immediately began throbbing, but she managed to break free from the killer, and she threw the car door open and began running into the field. The killer rushed out of the car, caught up to Laura, and tackled her to the ground. Laura tried to fight back, but the killer was too strong, and they climbed on top of her and pinned her down. Then, the killer reached over, grabbed a rock off the ground, and slammed it into the side of Laura's head multiple times. Blood sprayed from the wounds, and Laura stopped moving. But the killer wasn't done. They dropped that rock and picked up a bigger one. And they raised it up and then slammed it down right square in the middle of Laura's face over and over again. Finally, the killer stopped. They dropped the rock, stood up, and looked down at what they had done. Laura lay there, dead in the grass. The killer began to panic, but they quickly came up with a plan. They ripped off Laura's jacket, her shirt, her jeans, and her underwear, and then stuffed her underwear into Laura's right hand. And then they deliberately posed her legs so her legs were spread open. When the killer stepped back and took a look at their work, they saw Laura's eyes were staring up at them. So they grabbed the jacket and covered most of Laura's face with it. The killer was about to head back to the car, but they looked down and noticed Laura's blood on their jeans. So without thinking, they just took off their jeans, they also grabbed Laura's jeans off the ground, and they laid both pairs across Laura's body. After that, the killer ran back to Laura's car and drove back to the supermarket where Laura worked. After parking the car, the killer scanned the parking lot. When they saw it was all clear, they hopped out and took off running in their underwear. And when they got there, they found their stepfather waiting for them. Laura's high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, was her killer. It turned out Kyle was not okay with their breakup, like he had told police. In fact, the idea of Laura seeing anyone other than him filled Kyle with jealousy and rage. So much so that he had begun stalking Laura. And on the night before her murder, he followed her and her date, a man who was never identified, to the club. Kyle hid in the shadows and watched Laura dance all night, and then he followed Laura and her date back to the guy's apartment, and then waited outside while they had consensual sex, and then followed them when Laura's date drove her back to her dorm. The following day, Laura and Kyle had plans to hang out like they still did sometimes, and when Laura handed Kyle her keys, he knew this was his chance to take her out to the middle of nowhere and make her pay for seeing other men. Like a lot of kids in town, Kyle had been to the farmer's land for parties, and he thought it would be a perfect place to confront Laura because nobody else would be around. But as soon as she yelled at him, he couldn't stand it and he punched her. And this was not the first time he had done that. In fact, during the second investigation, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp had discovered Kyle had regularly beaten Laura throughout their high school relationship. This, of course, raised a huge red flag, but it was the overlooked witness statement that enabled them to fully focus their investigation on Kyle. Because back in 1984, a young woman had told police that on the day of Laura's murder, she passed by Kyle driving on the road, and he was driving Laura's beige Oldsmobile, and Laura was not in the car with him. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp never understood why that lead had not been followed up on, and why Kyle and his stepfather's story about grilling steaks together had just been accepted. But with that witness statement, Dan and Sharp were almost positive Kyle was the killer, and DNA test results soon confirmed that theory. In a moment of desperation, Kyle had staged the murder to look like a sexual assault. He hoped it would lead police to the man Laura had gone to the club with and slept with the night before, but when Kyle saw Laura's blood on his jeans, he panicked and left them behind. Because there was no DNA testing at the time, Kyle would never have imagined that remnants of his own bodily fluids inside those jeans would someday allow police to trace the jeans right back to him. Kyle was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but with a chance for parole in 2042. Kyle's stepfather, who had covered for him in 1984, was deceased by the time Kyle was arrested. Dan had ultimately kept his promise to Laura's mother. He had found her daughter's killer. Dan also said that if he and Kyle are both still alive in 2042, he will be front and center at Kyle's parole hearing, and he'll do everything he can to make sure Kyle never gets out of prison. There are 3 waterfalls spanning the Canadian-USA border that combined make up the famous Niagara Falls. They have a max height of about 170 feet at their highest point, and every second, 700,000 gallons of water tumbles over the edge. The rapids above the falls are some of the strongest and most violent in the world, with a max speed of about 40 miles per hour right before you hit the edge. As a result, no one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to this small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids. But it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke. And so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around, and he can't believe he survived. But he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding onto was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log and they waved to him. And Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued, but also was becoming hypothermic. And he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities and a rescue effort was launched. And because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph. And this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize. And witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters. And then seconds later, he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said, "damages." Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic and it's since been removed from the social media platform. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. In 1996, 28-year-old Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. He had left school after the 10th grade and joined the highly competitive and prestigious Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Created in 1962 in response to their domineering neighbor, China, the Border Police specialized in high-altitude landscapes. They had to, given that the boundary between India and China ran through the very rugged Himalayan mountain range. 12 years after joining the Border Police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the Border Police's most ambitious missions to date. While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. He was excited and he was confident. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. But their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude, Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky, not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision-making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone, because literally, while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there
that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Paljor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Paljor was the commander, and so at 3 p.m. when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Paljor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Paljor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Paljor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Paljol or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Paljol's death on the north base of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Paljor, one of the first Indians to climb the north base of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Paljor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. Which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Paljor. Here is an image of Paljor, aka Green Boots. Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid, what he's talking about can't be serious, and when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on, and then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house, and he put it under his arm, and then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him. And as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything. And he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that. But a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that. And Richard was like, no, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about. And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on, and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, you know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal. And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay? And at first Richard was like, wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall? But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, you snubbed me in the lunch line. And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line. Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up, and Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying, that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. all the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird," well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Gian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Gian must be. But Gian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Gian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Gian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Gian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Gian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Gian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak. And then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed, and here we are. He has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles. But it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again.
In 1976, Mary Gillespie lived in Circleville, Ohio, with her husband, Ron Gillespie, and Mary was a bus driver for the local school. And one day, she came home from work, and she found a letter that was addressed specifically to Mary. It had no return address, and it was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. The letter effectively said,
"We know you're having an affair with the superintendent of the school. You must stop and come clean and tell your husband. If you don't, bad things are going to happen to you. We're watching your house. We know you have children."
Now, Mary was obviously frightened. She was scared for her kids. She was scared for herself. She didn't really know how to react to this letter, so she just ignored it and hoped that it was a hoax and that it would just stop. But a week goes by, and she gets another letter. This letter was even more threatening, saying that
"If you don't stop this now, we are going to harm you. This is not a joke."
Mary decided to ignore that letter too. But literally the next day, her husband Ron woke up one morning and got the mail and found a letter addressed to him. The letter had no return address and was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, just like the first 2 letters sent to Mary. The letter to Ron said that his wife was having an affair with the superintendent of the school, and that if he didn't confront her and get her to admit the truth and get it to stop, that Ron's life would be in
grave danger.
Ron is horrified to read this letter. He hadn't suspected anything of his wife. This was very uncharacteristic. And so he went to Mary and he said, "Hey, I got this letter. What is this? I've gotten 2 of these letters. I've just been ignoring it. I didn't know what to do." And she aggressively denied any accusation that she was having an affair. She said, "I'm not doing any of that." And so Ron believes his wife and says, "You know what? I don't know what this is, but I believe you. Let's ignore this. This will go away. I don't know what this is, but it'll go away." A week later, Ron receives another letter addressed to him, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. This letter said,
"Ron, it's been a week and you haven't done anything. You have to get her to admit the truth. Otherwise, not only are we going to put your life in danger, we're also going to broadcast what she's doing all over town on billboards, on radio, and on TV." So
at this point, Ron and Mary are scared. Ron is still standing behind his wife. He believes his wife that she has not had an affair, that this is just some horrible hoax, but they're scared. But they don't really want to go to police yet. They kind of want this to just go away. So their first step is, let's tell some people in our inner circle just to kind of put this out there and see what other people think.
And so the three people that were closest to Ron and Mary were Ron's sister's husband, named Paul Freshour, and Paul's sister. So it's a little confusing, but those are the players here. And so while Mary and Ron are telling, their inner circle about this anonymous set of letters they've gotten and all the threats involved, Mary starts to think that she might know who's been sending the letters. She has an idea of who it is. Now, we unfortunately don't know who this person is. It's been left out of anything I can find online, but she decides that it's in their best interest to proactively send this person a letter and basically say, you got to stop, or we're going to pursue legal action. And initially, when they started sending the letters, while it's unclear if they got any sort of response from this person, the letters, the anonymous letters, did stop. But that would all change in August of 1977 when Ron was home one night with the kids, Mary was out, and Ron receives a phone call. He picks up the phone call, and his kids would say that his entire demeanor changed. He went from calm and collected to angry, furious. He's talking to someone, and it's unclear what was said. We don't know exactly what was said or who he was talking to, but when he hung up, he tells his kids that I'm going to go confront the person who's been writing these letters. And so Ron grabs his pistol, gets in his pickup truck, and blazes off down the road. It's like he knew exactly where he needed to go. But literally minutes later, it was discovered that Ron had died. He crashed into a tree, and he died on impact. Now, nobody else was found at the scene. I mean, the sheriff and the police unit that went in to investigate, it was just Ron in a ditch against a tree. But they found that he had fired one shot out of his pistol. They don't know who he was shooting at or what he was shooting at, but he fired a shot before he crashed. The sheriff initially suspected foul play, but the sheriff changes his mind. He says, you know what? Ron was drunk. Ron was 1.5 times over the legal limit. So he was drunk driving and he crashed. But that didn't make any sense because Ron's family said Ron does not drink. And his kids said he hadn't had anything to drink that day. So at this point, the story starts getting very bizarre. After Ron's death, hundreds of other letters, anonymous letters, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, are sent to residents all over Central Ohio, not just Circleville, but all over Central Ohio. And the letters took a turn. Instead of being accusatory of Mary, although there was still some of that, it was the sheriff in Circleville is covering something up. And it was around this time that people started to speculate that perhaps the writer's agenda is not as clear. Initially, it seemed like they were targeting, Mary and Ron. And then when Ron is taken down, they're defending Ron. So following Ron's death, Mary is scared for her life. She just watched her husband die as a result of this horrible situation. And all these letters are pouring in all over Central Ohio with the same kind of nasty language about her and her supposed affair with the superintendent of the school. The letters are insinuating that the sheriff is covering something up with her husband's death. Her kind of dirty laundry is being aired out by this anonymous writer all over Central Ohio. And this goes on for years. And so finally in 1983, Mary is at a breaking point and she finally admits that she was having an affair with the superintendent of the school. Now she claims that it happened or it started after the first letters arrived, that it was just a crazy coincidence, but whether or not that's true, it's kind of secondary. And she thought that that would stop the letters, that the first thing that this person wanted was for her to admit this and stop this affair. So she comes out and she admits it and she puts an end to it thinking that's going to do it. But that didn't do anything. It actually made it worse. So in 1983, after she admits what was going on with her and the superintendent, she's on her bus route driving the kids to school, and she starts noticing these billboards and signs all over her route condemning her for her actions and saying she's this horrible person. And so she got mad. She went from being kind of a victim and scared to being mad. And so one day in 1983, she pulls over when she sees one of these signs and she gets out, she rips it out. And then when she puts it down, she notices there's a box that's a part of this kind of billboard contraption. And she kind of looks inside, and there is a loaded gun that has a wire wrapped around the trigger and the slack's been pulled out of it. Like it's literally ready to fire. And had she been standing at a slightly different angle when she pulled down the sign, it would have fired the gun and it would have shot her. So she calls police, police show up, they do an investigation, and they look at the weapon, and they can tell that someone very poorly tried to etch off the serial numbers on the weapon so that it couldn't be traceable. But they were able to lift the serial number, and they were able to trace it back to its original owner, who was none other than Paul Freshour. And so the police go to Paul, and they're like, "Is this your pistol?" And Paul was totally cooperative when he was approached. He's like, "Yes, I didn't report it, but that gun was stolen from me. I didn't set up that booby trap." The sheriff, who was the same one who investigated Ron's death, he didn't buy it, and so they made him submit to a handwriting test. It apparently totally swayed the jury. They were like, "You know what? Paul's the guy," and he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 to 24 years in jail. And so Paul goes to jail. And while he's in solitary confinement, more letters are sent out all over central Ohio. And they're all being postmarked out of Columbus, Ohio, even though he is in solitary confinement in Lima, Ohio. But no one wanted to listen to that. Everybody believed that Paul was the guy, even though he's like, "How could I have been writing these letters?" And so for 7 years, these letters are sent all over central Ohio, accusing the sheriff of this cover-up and condemning Mary for what she did. And then when Paul is up for parole, after 7 years, he stands before the parole board and they deny him parole on the grounds that he was sending these letters. Even though he's like, "How could I have been? I've been in solitary confinement most of the time." But they were like, "Too bad, you wrote the letters, see ya." And so he goes back to jail. And it was at this point that Paul he gets a letter. This letter was taunting Paul because they apparently had known that he was denied parole based on him being the writer. And instead of it being written in the first person, like I, it was written we. We are keeping you in jail for as long as we can. Basically saying, "Haha, we know you didn't do it. But we are going to keep you in jail for as long as we can." And they even said,
"That booby trap is not the only one. It's only a matter of time before somebody else finds one, and then you're going to get blamed for that too."
But following that letter, the letters stop. And so for 3 years, Paul remains in jail until he's up for parole again. And since there haven't been any more letters, and no one found any more booby traps, Paul's granted parole. Paul would maintain his innocence all the way until 2012 when he passed away. So in 1993, which was the same year that Paul was released from prison, the very popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries decides to cover this story. As soon as they are beginning to do research on it, they receive a letter from an anonymous person with no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, written in the same style handwriting as the Circleville writer. It said,
"If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay."
And so the staff and crew of the show had a decision to make. Is this a credible threat or not? Do we actually pursue this or not? And they ultimately decided that they had to do it now. And so they go into Ohio and they do their own research and they start questioning people that were involved in this case. And they come across a crucial piece of evidence that more than likely could have potentially kept Paul from going to jail. They discovered that there was another witness that was never brought forward, despite she made herself available. She was not used in the trial and was basically cast aside, but she was also she was a bus driver. And she was on the same route as Mary. And before Mary went to that booby trap sign and ripped it down and almost was shot, this bus driver was ahead of Mary. And when she passed by, she saw there was a yellow, flashy El Camino sports car parked near the sign. And standing outside of the car near the sign was a man who did not match the description of Paul Freshour at all. And when she was interviewed by Unsolved Mysteries in 1993, they were like, "Really? The sheriff? Nobody wanted to talk to you about this?" And she's like, "Yeah, I told them that I'm available and no one wanted to talk to me about it." So Unsolved Mysteries, they air the episode and nothing comes of it. They don't get any more threats. There's nothing. It just gets aired. It's very interesting. And that's that. Really, at this point, you're left with a collection of people, the police included, that fundamentally believe that there is no mystery. It was Paul Freshour. He's the guy that wrote these letters, that set up the booby traps. He went to jail for it, and that's that. But there's another group of people that believe Paul didn't do this, that he went to jail for something he didn't do. And one of those people is a journalist by the name of Martin Yant. And so Martin, along with a large number of people, believe there are 3 additional suspects that should have been looked into or should be looked into now that could have been the writer. The first one is the superintendent of the school, the one that Mary was accused and then admitted to having an affair with. The second was a co-worker of Mary's that apparently was infatuated with her. And then the third one was Paul Freshour's wife. So they were married when the Circleville writer drama unfolded, but they ultimately divorced. She left him and she ended up getting together with another guy. So she's got a boyfriend, and the boyfriend matches the description of the guy standing next to the El Camino at that sign in 1983. And one of this guy's relatives owned a yellow El Camino. But nobody ever followed up. The police aren't looking into it. Paul Freshour is the guy, and they're not about to reopen this case. For me, the letters that got sent out all over central Ohio while Paul is in, solitary confinement, to me, that is like the number one thing that makes me doubt that Paul was the guy. Now, could he have been involved? Certainly. I think that that's definitely possible, but I think that more than likely what we're looking at here is there was more than one writer. Maybe there was a whole group of them, but it's just unclear what their agenda was. And the whole thing is just very confusing. There's lots of people involved, lots of drama. It's like the most epic drama that's unfolded in the most obscure place in the country. But it is what it is, and it's certainly a fascinating mystery, and I would love to hear what your theories are. Was it Paul Freshour? Was it one of the 3 suspects that I just listed off that Martin Yant thinks it was? Or was it something else? I'd love to hear it in the comments. I'll do my best to go through the comments and respond to as many people as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please gently bash the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like today's story, the dark, strange, and mysterious. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, same as my YouTube channel, and I go live over there Monday, Tuesday.
City lights cut through the night. A distant whistle calls the line. One door opens, time stands still. Only a heartbeat left to ride. Still tracks lead beyond the skyline.
And go to rust and shame. Word on the street is jelly people. What's a leather jacket, crimson whips and neon glasses, laser beams and lightning flashes, testing all my gadgets in the basement. I get aces, I got stashed away for rainy days. Focus when I calibrate. Got my pistol cocked, not safe. Clocks say it's late. My energy's electric. Do they scribble dirty lies under my name? Circling back, it's just negative fame. Jealous eyes turn gold to rust and shame. Word on the street is jelly people. my consciousness, not flawless.
Wednesday and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I hope to see you over on other channels or here on YouTube or all of them. But either way, I really appreciate your support. And until next time, see you guys.